I'm only going to look at cinematography, mainly how do they portray space in the movies, and a little bit of spoiler alert. All right, I'm not going to give away grand finales or anything, but there will be some spoilers. If you haven't seen certain movies, all of these movies I'm going to list to you are fantastic to watch. Even the 1920s, 1930s ones you can find on YouTube nowadays. It's fantastic. And then up to the more recent ones. But before I get started with that, I want to actually travel back in time here. I want to look at a little bit of the history. How did we actually get started about thinking about space? We've always thought about the epics. Especially Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. We've always found the great hero voyaging across the sea, battling monsters and the gods of the heavens and the underworld and so on. But what about space? What triggered that? So there's actually some bits and pieces of history that are very entertaining. One particular thing is the 4th, 5th century BCE. Greek plays having air travel. If you go through it, actually lists airplanes. Just very mechanical, very simple mechanical birds of the sky. But that's not particularly space just yet. It's great for travel, but what about space? What about otherworld traveling? Even stellar warfare has actually made an appearance at very early stages. So the earliest one to date, that is actually the popular one, is 2nd century. This is really astounding. 2nd century, people of the moon battling people of the sun. It is complete interplanetary war, this whole narrative. So it goes through interplanetary warfare, the different kinds of species that we could actually come across. It's quite spectacular. And then somewhere in the middle, they have space spiders. And there's a lithograph from the 1800s of said space spiders from that narrative. I don't even want to know. I don't like spiders, so if it's space spiders, I am done. If we come across space spiders at some point, nope. I'll switch my job. But continuing on with that, so going from 2nd century now to 10th century, a Japanese narrative, very similar to the whole Superman origins. You have a moon princess sent to Earth to safety, being raised by a simple farmer and then sent back to the moon to behold her reign. Very, very similar to certain Superman origins there. And then 1001 Nights, which you guys may have remembered that to be Arabian Nights. Again, 10th century. They have mechanical horses that fly to the sun. Very, very, very astounding stuff. So now we're getting not only into planetary warfare, moon, sun, and Earth, but now we're getting into mechanics. Now we're getting into almost robotics, but not using the word robotics. They really didn't know robotic yet, but certainly metal, using live metal. They are not human. And then Age of Reason is the spark of most of it, especially Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. That's still in a little bit of debate as to why that would be considered space travel, but it's considering to be otherworldly. So that's why it's on this list. Cyrano de Bergerac, Empires of the Moon is actually quite entertaining to read. But certainly Johannes Kepler, certainly his work. Kepler is the one who gave us our physics laws of how the planets move around the sun. He's the one who starts all the physics of how do we go about how fast is the Earth moving around the sun? How fast is Pluto moving around the sun? Thank you, Kepler. So even his writings have really advanced that. I like Voltaire's Micro-Maga. One of the first early versions of, well, what if those other beings are actually more advanced than Earth? So we'll actually see that a lot more Thank you to Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Very, very famous books. I implore you to read them, especially War of the Worlds. I love that one. But 1800s, late 1800s, fantastic works. War of the Worlds I'll talk about later as far as movie goes as well. So going through all the literature has now set up great. Now we have ideas of how we want to expand that to film. Now we're going to go into different kinds of eras of films. And you actually see a really weird trend come through certain eras, though. It's really fascinating, though. So first one, the silent era, the silent movies. But certainly our spark to go, hey, let's try to see if we can put a rocket on a shoestring and put it in front of a camera and see what happens. I mean, by all means, that was the movie technique of the day, but it was certainly imaginative, especially Voyage to the Moon, 1902. A Trip to Mars, that is actually I believe that's Danish, and then Woman in the Moon. So going from black and white, very simple mechanics of like, hey, let's just send stuff to space. Then we get into the serial era, the Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. Yeah, this is where it starts to get really fun. Get creative with it. Let's just strap random shapes of objects and flashing lights and whatnot. We weren't really getting into color just yet, but certainly the adventurous, explore other worlds kind of hero. Then, this is my favorite, October 30th, 1938. Let you guys read that quote there. Particularly, I can see peering out of that black hole 2 luminous disks. Are they eyes? Anybody want to take a guess as to where this is from? Yes, War of the Worlds radio drama. If you have not listened to it, listen to it. It is fantastic. So the radio drama directed by Orson Welles actually recounts all of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds narrative, but to a realistic sense. The book is actually based out of Britain. Orson Welles changes it up where it's based out of New Jersey at that particular night, October 30th, 1938. And as the public is tuning in, do they enjoy it? They're like, oh, this is great. This is a sci-fi narrative. What do they think of it? Nope. Mass panic. Absolute panic. People started to run to their cars and call their families and, oh my gosh, it's coming toward you, and are you safe, and evacuations. And so the newspapers had a field day with this, absolute field day. So now any time that radio dramas had to be played, they had to specifically stop at every half hour or hour and specifically say, this is just a dramatization, and then continue on with the play. And Orson Welles actually had to have an apology over the radio at some point too, but the newspapers were like, this is gold. This is great. Mass panic. But, I mean, at the time, there was still quite a bit of mass panic, especially when it comes to Sputnik, whenever that came about in 1957. There was still that awe of, oh, wait, we want to build a space program. The Soviet Union wants to build a space program. Now we're in a space race. We're getting into spy era in that regard. So this is just on the opposite side here of movies. What's going on in real life? We have Department of Defense wanting to do rocket research. Then we have Sputnik, and then a year later we had Explorer 1. So now we're like, okay, now that we actually have physical objects up in space, we got to up our game. Up our game with cinema. Try to bring in people to see more movies. We have the visitor era. So there's actually quite a bit of movies with this one, but this is the visitor era. having beings come visit us. How do we communicate? Do we immediately draw arms, or do we just kind of sit there and panic, let them take over the world? Oh goodness, my favorite being Day the Earth Stood Still, so there is lovely Gort. And then this island Earth with the really bad costuming, which is fantastic as well. A lot of these movies with the costuming is just fantastic. But again, it's all with the creativity. How do they represent how these visitors would have been? And at the time, they would have looked almost humanoid. I mean, obviously the claw hand and the big bulbous brain there is obviously not humanoid, but certainly the costuming of, you have a man in a costume. So nothing with tentacles and or something goopy in that regard. You do have The Thing, but that's considered a horror movie in that regard. Just a little homage to Day the Earth Stood Still. All right. 1960s, again, with the creativity, but now let's make it flashy. Let's not just make the aliens flashy, let's make our spacesuits flashy. Let's figure out what would spacemen look like. This is my favorite picture from Journey to the Seventh Planet. The colors are absolutely astounding. The yellow and blue just pops right out. Moon 02 almost looks very similar, little antenna. The second one I wanted to include, and just for comedic sake, it's really funny. It's on YouTube. Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. So this is the movie poster for it. This is actually a movie. It's very entertaining to watch. So I just want to pick out some certain things here. So you can see in the top right corner there how the Martians would be just a little antenna sticking out of their helmets. So the premise of this is that Martians celebrate Christmas too, but Santa's busy on Earth. Well, Martians want Santa too, so they kidnap Santa. So then they can have Santa bring presents to the Martian kids. And then it turns into, well, now the Martian kids want to meet the Earthling kids, and just kind of like, let's form friendships. And then in the end, there's a really giant mechanical robot that wants to destroy the friendship, and no, we can't have this, and Martians rule. And Santa Claus was like, oh, I have magic, and decides to shrink the robot down to toy size. So technically, this movie was all a marketing scheme, if anything else, to actually sell mechanical robots that look like that. So brilliant on their part of like, you defeat the villain, make it a toy, sell it. Great. But another thing I'd like to point out too, one of the magical, well, what do Earthlings do? Those are laundry baskets. Let's show the Martians how we do laundry. Okay, sure. Not like it's 1950s. There's a little bit more to 1950s, but okay, sure. Back to NASA. Now we're getting into 1960s. Finally, Apollo. Even before Apollo, you have the Mercury and Gemini missions. We're finally getting to send people up into space. We finally have that technology and that willpower to start sending people up into space and see what happens, especially Apollo 8 orbiting the moon. And then finally Apollo 11 landing on the moon. Very spectacular. Nixon was very proud. So in that regard, now the switch of movies has now gone from crazy aliens and spacefaring adventurers and let's change up the spacesuits and the rockets. Now we're getting into technology. How can we change the astronauts' technology? How can we change how the rocket moves in space? So, 2001 Space Odyssey, I will get to later because there's a lot to talk about with this movie. A lot. So I will get right back to Space Odyssey, but just letting you know, 1968, great movie. All right, 1970s, the government era. This was kind of scary time for films as far as the theme goes. So now we're getting into government is bad for the space agency. And it gets really weird, especially Capricorn 1. Capricorn 1, you have astronauts who have lost funding. And NASA is like, no, you can't go to the moon. It's been defunded. You're out of here. And the astronauts still want to go to the moon. They're going to try to steal a rocket to go to the moon, and the government hunts them down. Oops. Actually, not a good ending for that movie. Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's a lighthearted movie, more lighthearted movie, but then it goes into like Area 51, the secret government base, and let's just hide everything on a mountain and play musical notes to aliens. Moonraker, I wanted to include this one. Moonraker is actually a James Bond space movie. How many times do you get to say that? He actually doesn't really get to go into space until much later in the movie, but it's still shuttle manufacturing, part of the government. And then Alien. Alien is definitely part of this theme. Especially if you have not seen Alien, please do so. But essentially, the crew has become expendable to the government, and they don't realize it until way later in their mission. And then mass panic and so on and so forth. I would probably panic too if I'm stuck out in space and then I was called expendable. Not good. All right. So 1980s to present, then it just starts to go everywhere, absolutely everywhere. It's mainly towards special effects. How can we press our limits to special effects, especially computer special effects? The storytelling kind of starts to go by the wayside on some movies, but it's essentially, how can we make this better? Great. So there's actually 9 different categories that I'm going to go through that actually have, you could fit almost any kind of space movie into those 9 categories. Biographical, definitely natural disasters. Who doesn't love a good natural disaster movie, right? The psychology of being stranded, the rescue, the new home, life comes here, we mess with life, artificial intelligence and technology. So some biographical films, beautiful pieces of work, usually taken from an actual autobiography or a biographical book. All of these I recommend. There are certainly more, like I had said, there's certainly more movies, but top 3 here, Apollo 13 by Ron Howard, fantastic movie. Fun fact about Apollo 13, when the premiere of the movie first came out, Ron Howard actually had little comment cards to give to the audience because he really wanted to see, was it too hardcore? Was it boring in some parts? He just really wanted to know the audience's reaction to Apollo 13. And it got great, thumbs up, fantastic, except for one note. One note. And Ron Howard was still like, wait, what? The one note actually said, this will never happen. Either that guy completely missed the memo, or, nope, that's basically it. He missed the memo. The other 2, Hidden Figures, it's a great book as well, and a fantastic movie. October Sky. I'm actually from West Virginia, so we actually love Homer Hickam and the Rocket Boys. We are very much aware of their kindred spirit. The fun fact here, too, if you switch around the letters of October Sky, you spell out Rocket Boys. Yeah, really fun. All of their license plates say October Sky. I know the Rocket Boys, so they're very fun bunch. All right, the natural disasters. This can go it's usually something's gonna hit Earth. Those are really fun to watch with a group of astronomers because we're all just sitting there like, I wonder how we can image that. I wonder how we can take data. We're the ones who are excited about it coming close to us. Whereas everybody else is in mass panic going, how do we stop it? We're like, no, this is actually pretty cool. We want to know the physics behind it. And, let's take some pictures. Let's take some data before you guys all destroy it. That's fine. But most of those movies start out where no one seems to have done their job up until a certain point where it's too late and go, we need some experts to stop this thing. Where was the technology to find it just thousands of miles away to make its trajectory over? We had the technology in 1992. The Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet was actually going to have a nice trajectory to Earth, and we were ready for it. It was way past Jupiter at the time. We're like, great, we already mapped out its orbit. We had the technology. What happened to these guys? Unfortunately, we never got to see that comet because Jupiter's gravity actually pulled the comet away from its trajectory and then ripped it apart and then ate it. Oops. So that would have made an interesting movie, but nope, we're going to have a 7-mile wide comet come right at us and cause mass extinction. Sure, that sounds appealing too. Okay. And then Interstellar kind of takes it away from not something's going to hit us, but we're already under severe conditions. We're already in natural disasters of dust storms and starvation. And you'll see that some of these movies will cross over in other themes as well. The stranded psychology. These could go several different ways. Apollo 18, it's a very interesting movie, 2011 movie, where supposedly NASA had canceled the Apollo 18, but NASA actually secretly sent Apollo 18, and they get stranded on the moon because there's creatures. So not a good ending for that particular movie. Gravity, you have Sandra Bullock as a biomechanical engineer, and she gets stranded. So her complex is more of a giving up. She almost gave up on her mission. She almost gave up on her life. She almost just gave up on the whole thing of like, yep, okay, I'm stuck up here, not going to do anything. And then she finally gets the willpower and all is well. The Martian. Awesome movie. Whereas Mark Watney gets stranded on Mars after some interesting events on Mars. He was basically claimed dead on Mars. Wakes up, has to heal himself and whatnot. And instead of just sitting there going, well, I'm stuck here, I don't know what to do, no, he's like, yeah, you know what? Science can help me out of this. Science is going to be my best friend in all this. And through some random happenings, but yes, the science is fantastic. Read the book because it actually goes through some of the science that he does in the movie. It's a great book, and I believe it's back there on the table. The rescue/repair mission. There's several movies that fit under this thing because, by all means, we want to rescue our own. All right? If something happens way out there, of course, we want to have some sort of rescue mission. Now, whether it turns out good is another thing altogether, because it could completely be bad, like Europa Report. There was basically a failed rescue mission and a repair mission. Oops. But certainly like Apollo 13, repairing the capsule and then trying to return them back to Earth using physics. Lots of physics. Again, returning certain vessels that have been lost for many, many years, and then the typical distress signal comes out of nowhere. Oh, we got to check it out. But then it kind of makes me wonder, if you haven't heard a signal for 20 years on that vessel, pretty sure you would have had to do something about it much earlier. You're like, oh yeah, that vessel way out there, we completely forgot all about that. That would not happen. This is all funded money to put this stuff out in the space. We like to keep track of what we're funding to put out in the space. If we could still keep track of Voyager 1, we could keep track of these tiny vessels all the way to Jupiter. I think Neptune is the farthest one out of all these movies that a vessel has been placed. Finding a new home. So this goes into we're destroying our Earth. We got to find a new planet in some sort or another. Red Planet movie from 2000. We have overpopulation and pollution, so we're going to seed Mars. We're going to start terraforming Mars, which, by the way, is impossible. Very impossible to do on Mars. WALL-E. I love WALL-E. It's so cute, but it gives us a particular image. So this is actually a scene from WALL-E. You can see just all the pollution, all the space junk that's going around. I mean, by all means, we have a bad space junk problem right now, but on Earth, we have just such a buildup of just junk and trash and overpopulation. So we're going to send everybody out into space and not return to Earth just yet. And then Interstellar, the whole point of Interstellar is to find plan B. It's not that easy to find plan B, unfortunately. We got one Earth. The Life Comes Here movies are certainly the more creative ones, especially how zany can you make the aliens? And then how do we communicate with aliens? So I had to include Mars Attacks. I just had to. It's just so bizarre of a movie. It had to be put on the list because there was an attempt to make a communication with these Martians. They didn't want to communicate back, and they just kept zapping everybody. Hey, fine. But there was an attempt. There was an attempt, and they got scared by a peace dove. And that's when it all started. And then you have certainly Independence Day. Independence Day actually gave rise to a trope of you're having almost like a queen, in a sense. Alien certainly started that, and then Independence Day kind of brought that about again, of like having a hive, almost hive mind of aliens. And then Arrival. I'm still a little unsure about Arrival. Has anybody seen Arrival? All right, did you guys like it? Yeah? Okay. From a planetary perspective, I like the concept. The linguistics, fantastic. But having only like one person involved, it's usually a whole team should be involved. And granted, she passed a test and so on, but typically there's like a whole team involved. And then we mess with life. Poor John Hurt. Poor John Hurt from the Alien franchise. All of the Alien franchise. We will not learn. Don't touch the eggs. When I actually saw Alien Prometheus with a bunch of planetary people. And the first one that dies is the geologist, and I am a geologist, so I screamed in the movie theater like, no! The geologist would not touch anything. As a geologist in training, a geologist would not randomly go, oh, I'm going to poke the egg. Poke. Oh, look at that, something popped out of the egg. I'm going to take a much closer look. No. No. Just no. So, John Hurt, unfortunately, gets what he deserves. Sorry, Sir John Hurt. Doom is an interesting one. Going into what they think might be aliens on Mars is actually transmuted humans that have been stuck on Mars in a research facility, and then they've been playing around with chemicals that they shouldn't touch, and then bada bing, bada boom, they turn into aliens. Hey. Not bad for a 2005 movie. Hey. And then, again, Europa Report. I'm not going to spoil much about Europa Report because it's an interesting movie. Artificial intelligence. I'm not going to review the new Blade Runner movie. Just so you know, I like the original. We're going to stick with the original, the whole replicant. But in the sense of artificial intelligence with a conscious, with emotion, with some sort of feedback toward humans. It's not like beep, boop, boop. 2 + 2 = 4. No. Now we're getting into more sentience with robotics. So these are very interesting movies, especially 2001: Space Odyssey. How many of you guys actually seen 2001: A Space Odyssey? Good. Yay. Good. Awesome. Yay. All right. And then WALL-E. Certainly fun kids movie, but it brings about that sentience. And then technology. I wanted to include Destination Moon 1950 because it brought a really wonderful sense of special effects with the movie. So that's Destination Moon up there. Yeah, you see a lot of knobs and dials and whatnot, but it was very realistic. And even Isaac Asimov even said it was the first intelligent science fiction movie of the time. It was really, really spectacular. 2001: Space Odyssey, a lot of technology. I'll get to that here in a bit. Contact. Really surprisingly not well-known movie. But Contact brought in radio telescopes, the technology that if we can communicate to aliens, can aliens communicate back to us? So radio astronomy has now made an appearance in the cinemas. Unfortunately, radio astronomy still hasn't made much of an impact on cinema. I kind of wish it would, because not all astronomers, surprisingly, use telescopes. That seems to always be the theme with some of these, like, oh, something's going to hit us, go to the telescope. No. We have cameras in space. We have radio telescopes. We have radar telescopes that can pick out even the tiniest asteroid. You don't always need a telescope. So Contact is a fantastic movie when it comes to use of technology. Certainly Interstellar, and certainly The Martian, using previous Martian rovers, kind of tearing them apart for wiring and communication purposes, and then revamping those electronics. All right, now I'm going to get into a little bit about 2001: A Space Odyssey. I wish my advisor was here because he's more of a nerd about it than I am, but I will try to do him proud. He actually gave me some notes to include on my presentation because he knew I was doing this presentation tonight, and he loves space movies. Okay. So just some interesting things to think about with 2001: A Space Odyssey. There were several mentions when it comes to critiquing this movie of how does this movie measure up to everything else? How is this movie not necessarily unique, but certainly how is it unique of how it does it show that theme? So it's very unique that it showed man's place in the universe. Any kind of critique you read about this movie, even when it was first made in 1968, you always see some sort of man's place in the universe quote. Certainly artificial intelligence, the HAL 9000, one of the best movie villains, I can tell you right now. HAL 9000, one of the great villain. Superior beings that are not bad. Usually with movies, of all the movies I just gave you just now, I usually have some sort of alien that wants to hurt us, or do we want to hurt them? We're finally getting a taste of some sort of superior being that isn't like, oh, I'm just gonna squash you. You're inferior. No. No, we actually have beings that want to help us advance our technology. So that's certainly interesting. This next point, very spectacular. One of the first films for space travel silence. Sound cannot travel in space. None whatsoever. It's a vacuum. So like the tagline for the Alien movie, no one can hear you scream in space. It's like, yeah, that's pretty much it. But usually with like the Star Trek and Star Wars and certain movies, you hear the all of that in space. You shouldn't hear any of that. Not even the phasers. No. Lasers shouldn't even make a noise to begin with. But yeah, space travel silence. Certainly a visual effects pioneer. And then how do we communicate to aliens? We meet these superior beings. what are we going to say? How are we going to act? Are we just going to say, hi, my name is Fred, and shake their hand? No. But Carl Sagan was actually a key mind behind how to actually communicate with aliens. If we were to ever meet aliens, Carl Sagan was on the spot, helped with the script. So there is actually quite a bit of accuracy to it. And then I'll get to another film with accuracy as well. But with the accuracy, the movie actually had a lot of consultants. NASA engineers were part of it. MIT, the co-founder of the Artificial Intelligence Lab, was brought in to figure out how would Hal interact with the astronauts up to a certain point. Hal eventually becomes almost a mental breakdown in the movie. How would that progression work for a mechanical being? So that guy certainly brought it in. And then the whole man versus machine, how would we react to such an action? How would we react to Hal breaking down? Are we just going to go, well, I give up? No, it's not a giving up movie. It's not a psychological stranded in space movie. No, but certainly how would the astronauts figure out, okay, obviously there's something wrong. How do we fix it? The weightlessness was one of the more accurate, surprisingly accurate ones, again by NASA engineers, helped out with that. And then the time delays. I can't tell you how many times I've seen of movies where the astronauts are talking to Earth and they're like, we got a situation up here, and they immediately get a response back. It doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. Hardly works now. But the time delay. The astronauts are aware that there's a time delay. If they need to say something, they need to say it as quick and concise as possible, and then wait. And waiting in this movie, you don't want to wait. But the technology in this movie, this is all I could list on the slide. There's certainly more, but this was the most impressive of the technology found in the film, though. Certainly learning computers, voice print identification, chess playing computer, Hal plays against one of the astronauts. It's fantastic. They also have iPads. They have Skype. Skype being personal video messaging. Flat screen TV monitors. It's fantastic. The digital tablets, very much like a little iPad. And then suspended animation and moon colonization. So it being a 1968 movie, most of the technology then comes after. Now, most of these were still in very much prototype in the 1960s, but wasn't actually put to use until those dates, especially when it comes to the personal video messaging. Way not until the 1990s, because we didn't have the bandwidth capability of our internet. So having such technology in a 1968 film and then completely seeing that come about in real life, it's so cool. Now, I put these two as theory right now because we're still working on suspended animation. We have not perfected that as well, and obviously we don't have a colony on the moon. We'd like to. We really would. It's still a little tricky because of radiation, but we'd like to. But everything else is fantastic. So little clips and pieces there. So we have the Skype, we have the iPad, and we have Hal playing chess. Absolutely fantastic. And here's a picture of Hal. Ta-da! So another movie, I unfortunately didn't have time earlier to make up a quick slide for this, though. But what is the most modern movie that we would consider to be scientifically accurate to date? And it's actually The Martian. So Interstellar is fantastic when it comes to black hole theory, dark matter, dark energy, just definitely the theoretical astrophysics side of stuff. And by all means, Kip Thorne, who now has a Nobel Prize for physics for gravitational wave science, fantastic. He was one of the consultants for Interstellar. Fantastic movie. But it's all theoretical. It's very much all theoretical. So The Martian actually brings about a whole new realistic sense. NASA has really pushed forward with that movie of how accurate it can be. Anything from the composition of Mars, how dusty Mars can be, to the rovers, the communications, how hard is it to actually bring in previous people to work on the rovers. Because guess what? That actually happens in real life. If, say, I wanted Pathfinder data, it's not that easy to find. I actually have to contact the original people to send me a manual just to read their code. It's really, really quite complicated. And they show that beautifully in the movie of how complicated the steps are toward saving Mark Watney, who's stuck on Mars. Now, there are 2 instances in the movie that made us planetary people scream. How many of you guys ever have seen The Martian? Great, okay, I won't spoil too terribly much. But there are 2 particular things that kind of made us go, ah. One of them made NASA go, we actually never sent anybody to Mars. So we actually don't know how they're supposed to walk on Mars. So all the walking, all the movements that Mark Watney had to do on the surface is theoretical at this point. We sent astronauts to the moon to specifically figure out, okay, are their spacesuits enough? Are they heavy enough? The first round of astronauts, Apollo 11, they were bouncing. They were having fun. If you read the transcripts from Apollo 11, they are hysterical because they're like, hey, I'm bouncing, yay. They realize they need to put weights onto the boots. Mars, very similar. Hardly any atmosphere, very, very small pressure. So not terribly a lot of gravity. It shouldn't really be as bouncy as the moon, but it's not as easy as just kind of walking around in a spacesuit. Not really. So NASA has actually started to plan out how people should actually walk on Mars. Not only do they need to put platform weights on astronaut boots, which can get a little interesting, especially if you're not graceful like me, but also apparently you have to swing your hips around to adjust yourself to those weights. So NASA actually just figured that out, unfortunately, after the movie was made. But the main thing, the main theme to drive the whole movie, the big dust storm, big plot driver there in the whole movie, that actually cannot happen. Yes, Mars actually has global dust storms. They last for nearly 4 months in one global dust storm. You can't see the surface, you can't see the sun, your solar panels are going to go out, it's going to be bad. One, they don't make the storm out to be that bad. They see, some lightning, which can happen on Mars, and it just kind of comes and goes fine. But it picks up an object, and it hits Mark Watney unconscious. Wind pressure on Mars is not that strong. So they made it out to be like a gale force, dusty vortex of doom on Mars, when in reality, 100 miles per hour on Earth is only 11 miles per hour on Mars. So having those kinds of gale force winds on Mars has not been detected at all. So having a particular object come up and swing through and then basically pierce through the spacesuit and human skin, no. No. But if you didn't have that whole thing happen in the beginning of the movie, you wouldn't have a movie now, would you? So by all means, it was plot-driven. But besides the dust storm, everything else is perfectly fine. That's our most modern, accurate movie to date, preceding 2001 Space Odyssey. So thank you so much for coming. And if you want to listen to my radio show, you could actually Google KUAF 91.3, Scratching the Surface. You could actually listen to all of my previous episodes. I also have a blog that I do for the local astronomy club here as well. And then this is actually part of a space lecture series here at the Fayetteville Public Library. So my round 3 of a lecture will be March 28th. I'm going to talk about women in astronomy. And it's actually quite surprising. I'm doing a lot of history research with this, and it is very surprising how much women are behind the curtain for a lot of astronomy. So thank you so much. I'm not going to spoil it, but be sure to look up The Day the Earth Stood Still. Yeah, The Day the Earth Stood Still.